Hi everyone, thank you for joining. So I'll be explaining this assignment and I'll be explaining the intention of this assignment which is given to you. So the purpose of this assignment is to evaluate if front-end development is what suits you and if this is what excites you and if this is where you will excel. Because if you have your passion in that field and if you have the skill set, then you'll probably do well. So this assignment is to establish that. Now, for you to be a good front-end developer, it's very important to have a good aesthetic sense. Now, let me differentiate the thought process between a front-end developer and a back-end developer. If you enjoy understanding the emotions of your user, you like seeing your users happy, you like understanding how your users feel when they use something. And if you enjoy seeing things beautiful, you enjoy organizing things in a neat way, you like painting, drawing, then you're a front-end developer. Aesthetic sense, right? Seeing things in a beautiful and organized way. Aesthetic sense is one thing. And the second thing is the user experience. If you want to improve the way your user feels while using a product. Now, if you don't care about the user experience and you become a front-end developer, the kind of tech you will make is like SBI ka tech, lunch ke baad aana. Right? Where you don't care about the end user. You make, or like IRCTC. You don't care about the end user. So when as a front-end developer, you care about how the user feels. You make technology which is very responsive. You make technology which is very intuitive. You make technology which people love to use. If you're a great front-end developer, even a 70-year-old man would use your mobile app without too many apprehensions. Somebody who's tech-averse also would use your technology. That's when you're a good front-end developer. When you can make the process great for everyone, including a 70-year-old man. Right? So if you like the user experience and if you have that aesthetic sensibilities and you're a developer, that is, you have that logical thinking, you have ability to write code, that's when you can make a good front-end, developer. But on the other hand, if you're somebody who's more of a logical person who likes to process large data, who likes to write large algorithms which can get something done, then you're probably more of a back-end developer who deals with all the data, who makes intelligent decisions based on the data, and those decisions are conveyed to the front end. So the front end uses that decisions to create a great experience for the end user, right? So if you're more of the data-oriented person, on DeepThought's website, you also have the back-end assignment. You guys can do the back-end assignment. But this assignment is if you enjoy, creating a great experience, great feeling for your user, and if you have that aesthetic sensibilities. Okay, this is what this assignment is trying to establish and understand. Now, in this assignment, there are two tasks, right? If you're able to do the first task, it means you're a good web designer. But if you're able to do both task 1 and task 2, that means you're a web developer. There's a difference between web designer and web developer. If you're able to make good static web pages, beautiful static web pages, then you're a website designer. You can make beautiful websites. But if you're able to make applications, dynamic applications with functionality, features, where the content keeps changing, where it interacts with the backend, where you can write dynamic content, that is when you're a web developer. A web developer can make applications, while a web designer can only design web pages. Now, this particular requirement is of a web developer and front-end web developer. That is why we are assessing both your aesthetic sensibilities as well as your ability to handle dynamic code. Okay, so now let's understand task 1. In task 1, you guys were given a Figma file and we are assessing your ability to replicate that Figma file as HTML, CSS code. Now, in Figma, when you hover over the element, when you inspect the element, it shows you the CSS code. If you do not know how, you can just search on YouTube, inspecting Figma files for CSS code. You will get videos, and from that you can understand how to get the CSS values from Figma. Now, while Figma gives you CSS values, sometimes what happens is, even though your CSS values on Figma are the same as the CSS values you're writing in your HTML code, you don't get that same experience. So it's kind of like spot the difference competition you would play in childhood. No, they'll give you 2 images and they'll ask you, okay, what this fellow's nose is like this, here the nose is like this. or this fellow's specs are a little different. You do that spot the difference thing, right? So it's kind of like that spot the difference competition, where you're trying to see, okay, what is in my Figma file? What is in my application? Why is my application looking different from the Figma file? You want your website to look beautiful. There, the padding you give, the margins you give, the alignments you have, all of that is important. If you're a front-end developer, you want to have that taste for, beauty. Now, let's say you're putting some text. That text is not center aligned in the button and it comes to the bottom. Your button looks imbalanced. Would it be beautiful? So you have a button. The text is at the bottom of the button. It is not center aligned. Then it looks, it doesn't look beautiful. So when you do your task one, you'd want to look at your, file carefully and you'd want to make it beautiful. And to make it beautiful, it's important that, see, why do you have a style guide? You have a style guide and then you have a CSS accordingly. You try not to use more than 2 fonts in the entire web page. As a front-end developer, if the designer gives you more than 2 fonts, go scold that fellow. Ask that fellow, what is this design? You don't want too many fonts, right? You don't want designs like those little kids, they bring all their color pencils and put all the colors and give you a design, no? Just because you have access to so many colors doesn't mean you use all of them. You guys understand a color palette, right? Every brand has one color palette, and in a color palette, we try not to have more than 4 colors. There's a color palette with 4 colors, and there are only 2 fonts, usually in the style guide. And the alignments, the padding, all of this, if you take care of, your, task 1 ka page will be beautiful. Usually the Figma file takes care of that. If you can replicate the Figma, your page looks beautiful. Sometimes what happens is that word gets eaten up. In process, one S goes off because your button is not big enough. So that's where you'd want to increase the size of your button. So these little things are very, very important to make sure that your page looks beautiful. So if you're able to complete task 1, you're a web designer. But you're a good web designer if you're able to do task 1 in a way that your task 1 looks very, very clean and aesthetic. That aesthetic sensibilities are very important for a front-end developer, right? This is point number 1. Now, point number 2, which is task 2. Now, task 2, please listen to this carefully. This is a little more technical because task 1 was just aesthetic, right? Aesthetic sensibilities, UI and so on. Task 2 is a little more technical. Now, when you handle a dynamic web page, which has a front end and a back end, it's okay. You don't need to know back end today. But you have to have an understanding of how your front end is going to work in coordination with the back end. So that you can plan, there's something which will come from the back end. I'll use that and make my front end. So that's where your task 2 comes into picture. In your task 2, you do a kind of templating. As if certain information which is coming in your HTML is dynamic. Right? It comes from your backend. That's where your templating comes into picture. Okay. Now, here, when you handle dynamic elements, there are 2 concepts here. Server-side rendering and client-side rendering. Certain information is rendered from the server. Certain information is rendered from the client side. Now, let us say I want Shrideep to enter any name of his choice, and that name, appears on the screen. It's like magic show. There's an application, Shrideep can enter a name, and that name ka photo shows up on the front end. Now, do you want this to be rendered from the back end? So let's say Shrideep writes a name and that name is visible. Number of letters in that name is visible on the front end. So do you want this to be rendered on the client side or do you want this to be rendered on the server side? Why? Because it changes.
Client side.
Changes dynamic.
Client side would be like, can I?
Yeah.
Yeah, client side would be a better option because that won't take much of performance.
It's not just about much of performance, but because you want that to be very fast.
No, yeah, that's what I meant. I mean, it won't take it won't be like taking time to perform some activity. It will be just statically
Say
delivered.
much of performance, I thought you meant resources. Okay. So you ideally, whatever you do on the front end, you don't want it to be resource intensive. If something is resource intensive, you would want to do it on the back end. Okay. So anyways, we are not bringing all of that because we understand that for an intern or a fresher, it's going to take some learning curve before you learn these things. But what I'm looking at is, let us say this data is not rendered on the server side. Let's say this data is rendered on the client side. Right? If this data is rendered on the client side, what does it mean? There is an API. That API is carrying that information. You read that information and you show that information on the front end. That is the thought process. But because we don't expect that you know API integration, we're not expecting that you know API integration. What we have done is, we said, declare a local variable. And you can store all this JSON data, which is coming from your API. All the JSON data, which is coming from your API, you can declare it within that local variable. And you can read all the local variable data within your JavaScript file. And that local variable data, you can show it in your HTML. Got it? So you're having variables, and based on the variable data, you're showing the things on the front end. Now, ideally, this could have been done differently also if it is server-side rendering. If it is server-side rendering, using templating concept, you can render them. But right now, you're not using templating concept. Right now, you're having a local variable, and through the local variable, you read the local variable values, and through the local variable values, you're going to render it, real time. If the local variables change, automatically this thing also changes. It's rendered from the front end, not from the back end. Okay. So task 2 is basically about your ability to not hard code. Hard code means you write there Shrikant Pakare. So it will work for Shrikant only. It won't work for Rahul Kumar. So task 2 is very, very important for us, because in task 2, we are able to understand whether you can handle dynamic code, whether you can write things in a dynamic manner. Are you hard coding, or are you writing a dynamic code which will change based on the variables? That is, when the API response changes, is your code automatically changing what is shown on the front end? For that, the idea is simple. You declare a local variable, you take all the contents, you store it in the local variable, you read it from the local variable, and whatever you're reading from the local variable, you can probably, that local variable could be an object, and all the elements you're reading could be attributes of that object, right? Let us say you call that object as local variable dot name, local variable dot address, local variable dot this. So all that JSON object things, you can store it as a local variable and read each attribute, and you can show that attribute in your HTML. This is what we're trying to evaluate in your task 2. And the second piece is, yes, we gave you some journey board, and we want to see if you have that basic understanding of JavaScript to expand and collapse that board. So in task 1, we're mainly seeing your HTML, CSS knowledge and your aesthetic sensibilities. HTML, CSS knowledge and your aesthetic sensibilities. That is task 1. Task 2, we're seeing your JavaScript knowledge in terms of handling that feature, that expand and collapse, one simple feature. And we're also understanding your ability to handle dynamic logic. Are you hard coding, or are you able to take a local variable and use that local variable to execute your code? We are assessing this in task 2. Okay. I will give you guys more personal feedback later. But first, before I stop this video recording, I would want to understand any doubts you have around these tasks. Please go ahead with your doubts around this task and your doubts around the thought process of the assignment itself. Good developers always ask questions. When you don't ask questions, if I ask you to do Ramayana, you'll understand it to be Mahabharata, and you'll implement Guru Granth Sahib and come back. It's important to ask questions so you understand the brief properly. So go ahead and ask your questions.
Is this the same task, like the journey board?
Yes.
And I just have to use the API data and store in the variable and then render it in the front end.
This is the task which one of the applicants submitted. So this needs a little rework on the aesthetic front, right? As I mentioned, I'm not naming the applicant, but one of the applicants submitted it. So you see here, category went missing, process S went missing, subthread is not aligned. This plus is here, subthread is here. The alignments are not proper. You see there's no margin here. You see this font size are different. It's not the same. And 1 minute, if I think about it, this is 1 minute. This is not a font. I think this is an image which is inserted. A font can be brought. This font is different. This font is different. This font is different. This font is possibly different. Too many fonts coming in, it's making it look very dirty and clumsy. If you have minimal fonts, it'll look neat. And alignments, right? You see where this is, they're not aligned together. You see where this is. Again, this gap and this gap are, I don't know, they don't appear same. So there are multiple aesthetic things which can be cleaned up in this, assignment. I understand that. See, I appreciate the applicant for submitting this. I'm just giving feedback so that this can be improved, right? Make it more aesthetic. And here I think he has a journey board. And yeah, this is expanding fine, but it's not collapsing. You probably need a close button here so that when I click the close button, the journey board collapses. Okay. So, and you'd want to declare a local variable so that whatever data you show, right, like this descriptions, or whatever data is coming here, that data comes from a local variable instead of it being hard-coded. Hard-coded means in your HTML, you're entering the string. You're entering the string instead of entering a variable there. So you don't want to be hard-coding. You want to be using a variable there. Okay. Next question, whoever has it, please go ahead.
So like you just said, like we will have to like attach a variable into that, right? So will we like, are you providing us an API?
No,
like
not
no.
Give it the JSON.
Yeah, JSON, right? I know, like okay, got it. But like in whatever we are getting, like are we getting some data from back, like what from JSON format? Like
giving you one JSON. I'm giving you one JSON. Declare a local variable. Declare a local variable. You can declare a local variable and input. You may input this JSON object to that local variable and use it.
Okay, got it.
The idea is, see, even if you do not know API integration, if you're able to do this, the idea is simple. You just make a network call. You read the API. You have to learn how to make a network call. You have to learn how to read an API. Once you read an API, you pass it to the local variable. You're done.
I know all of this. I know how to do the API integration.
Relax. Our assessment is to assess a candidate only for front-end, not to assess the candidate for API integration. Right? We are assessing a candidate for this. Now, if you know API integration, but you can't do this task, that again is a red flag for us. Because, see, sometimes what happens is people who come through this coaching institutes, they have some bad notions of how they do things. So they take too much time to become production ready. Just because you do these two tasks doesn't mean you're production ready. A lot of work has to go on before you can become production ready. Because sometimes what happens is most freshers and interns I see, they get confused with API integration. But what I'm telling you is if you can do this one task nicely, API integration is just another 4 to 5 lines of code. Where you make one network call to call the API and you take that in response from that API as a variable and you use that variable everywhere. That's it. But what do people do? They do all kinds of nonsense in terms of how do they do API integration. They write this logic of the code also inside that API. They make a mockery of that entire code. So that is why we are trying to see the ability of a candidate to do this piece, because if you can do this piece nicely, API integration is just another 4 to 5 lines of code, not much. But a lot of front-end developers tend to get confused with this. So that's why we've given this task. You're not going to use any APIs. Assume that an API already got you a JSON object. You declare a local variable. You give this value of this JSON we are giving you in the local variable, and you use the values of the local variable. So when we do your interview, what we'll do is I'll ask you to open your code. I'll ask you to change the JSON in front of me, and I'll see whether that is reflecting in your web page or not. That is to see whether your code is truly dynamic or not. Did I answer your question, Vishal?
Yes, sir, I got it.
Yeah, thank you, Vishal. Who wants to go in next? Feel free to ask all your doubts. If that, you know, that's when your misconceptions get cleared. Okay, and a small clarification here again. So what I was told is if I click this button and again I click this button, it is collapsing. So functionality wise, it is nice. But user experience, as a user, do I know that this is how it works? Instead, if you had put a close button and by clicking the close button, it collapses, the user experience would be better. Because you do not want it to be like a Sherlock Holmes experiment, right? Where I'm supposed to investigate and figure out how it works. You want it to be intuitive. Good, you achieved the functionality. You want to just put a cross button here and you can put the trigger for the same event. With a little effort, you can improve that. Yeah. Next question. Yeah, I'll count up to 5. Feel free to ask all your questions. I'm happy to answer all your questions now.
I have one more question.
Yeah, let's Srideep go in and then you can go in, Rohit.
Yes. Yeah. So like in this call, we just need to like make changes to the current project, right?
No, task 1, task 2, both we want it.
Yeah, both the things. You need to you want to like check us if the web page is truly dynamic or not. Right?
We'll do that. Yeah, because I've noticed that some of the applicants here who are on the call have not done task 2. If you have done task 2, we are going to review the task 2. But otherwise, because I've given you a lot of guidelines, you can refine your project and let Sharath know. Once you refine your project, that's when we'll have an interaction with you. Okay. If you have done task 1, task 2, both, fantastic. Just refine it as per the guidelines which I've given. If you have not done task 2, you can go ahead and complete task 2. It's not very complex, right? You just have to make some changes to your code. Does that answer your question, Srideep?
Yeah.
Yeah. Over to you, Rohit.
My question was like, there is a thread builder. So thread builder is a different component which is coming inside a different component. So like we have to make the thread builder as well, the thread builder and in the below the.
Here you're not. Either you can make it as a different component or you can have all of it as one application. That's also fine.
Okay.
You can have all of it as a whole or you can make it as a different component. We leave that to you.
Okay.
But I'll appreciate it if you can achieve it as a different component. But since it's a fresher role, we are not expecting that you're able to do that already. But if you do it, definitely we'll appreciate that. And I think that means your learning can be accelerated if you're able to achieve that as a component. I mean, those who are already familiar with React or Angular might probably be able to do that. But those who are doing with vanilla JavaScript might have challenges. That's okay. But if you're doing this in React or if you're doing it in Angular, yes, we would encourage you to do it as a component. Does that answer your question, Rohit?
Yes, Tarun.
Yeah. And again, I would reiterate, this project can be done in JavaScript or React or Angular. Any JavaScript-based stack is fine. Because if you're able to do in any of the 3 things, we understand that you can handle JavaScript. And if you can handle JavaScript, you can learn Angular, right? Because if you're hired for this role, you'll have to self-learn Angular. You'll be given some time to self-learn Angular and you'll join the project. You'll join the payrolls of the company once you're cleared by the tech team on Angular. But we'll help you learn that Angular. Okay. Anybody has a question?
But till what time we have to submit this?
By 4 o'clock today.
Okay.
But those who can't do it by 4 o'clock today, that's okay. We're doing continuous interviews. The next time when we're doing interviews, we'll take you in for that. But those who are going in for today's interviews, you can do it by 4 o'clock. Okay. So for those watching the video, we are going to have multiple interviews. So don't worry, just complete it. Now, yeah. Anybody else has a question?
So I have not created a variable. I have wrote a backend for the APIs. Is that okay?
No, we want you to declare a local variable and read from the local variable and do it. You can make.
No, I already made the website. Okay, the journey board, and I have integrated APIs from the backend.
Correct. So the way I want it is, I want you to read that API response as an object. as a, a local object which reads the API response, and I want the code to read the values from the local object.
Okay.
So you can,
Not from the backend.
from the backend, I read it as an object. I persist the data as an object, and from that object, I read it I access it on the front end.
Yeah, I did that also.
Absolutely. So all I will say is remove the API.
Okay.
So just have
I
a,
have to create a local variable.
that's it. Exactly. It's a hardly a 2 minutes job for you.
Okay, okay, sir.
It's hardly 2 minutes job. You just have to delete that API and have a local variable. And in that local variable, you can have all these. So when we test your code, what we'll do is we'll modify things in the local variable and do that. I appreciate that you were able to do an API integration. But in this
Okay.
task, as long as you're able to handle it as a local variable, we're fine with it.
Okay, sir.
Yeah. Okay. So this brings us to a conclusion. I'll quickly summarize, right? So we are trying to assess your ability to handle the responsibilities of a front-end developer role. And we have our assignment designed to see how clearly you think and how you go about executing things. Because look, there are lots of software developers, but there are some software developers who become high quality software developers over a period of time. So we're more of assessing your ability to learn, your coachability. Can you be coached, right? So that is why we've given you this assignment, and that's why we're sharing these guidelines also. So there are two tasks. Task one is assessing more of your aesthetic sensibilities and your understanding of HTML and CSS, right? So that HTML, CSS is not very tough. I mean, you can also copy paste code from the internet and achieve it, but it's more of your ability to, your aesthetic sense matters more, because task one HTML, CSS is a no-brainer. It can easily be done. But that padding, that margins, as I gave you that feedback, achieving that aesthetic sensibilities is very, very important. Good aesthetic sense is very important. Task one. Task two, we're assessing two things. One is your understanding of JavaScript in terms of are you able to collapse and expand the journey board. Right? That's a very basic thing. And the second thing we're looking at is your ability to handle, a dynamic web page. Are you able to take that local variable? Are you able to read everything from that local variable, right? How you do this is important. And your code structuring also. Do you have your CSS written separately, your HTML written separately, or JavaScript written separately? That is also very important for this task. And as you guys might agree, these tasks are very simple. We're not expecting too much from you, because we believe that when we're hiring a fresher, all that we want is somebody with, that baseline skills and with coachability, someone who can learn when given feedback. So very minimal things were given to you, and we expect that you execute these minimal things really, really well. And over and above that, you will be coached if you are joining the organization to produce production ready code, because we understand that it is very difficult to learn how to write production ready code unless you're in a team, right? No training school or finishing school can teach you how to write production ready code. Only when you're on a project you can learn that. That's fine. So as long as you're able to execute these two tasks and you're showing the right attitude, and in the interview, if you can explain your code, you explain your, you give us a good walkthrough, we'll ask you for some small changes. We can make those changes. And and we see that passion in your code. We're very happy to have you in our team. So that's about it. Thanks a lot for joining, and you guys can fine tune your assignments. And after that, we're very happy to schedule your interview. Thank you, everyone.